Here we go. All right. Wow. Last day of class. So, let's get to it because we have some ground to cover, including, let's see, I have some papers, but I want to give you the, hand out the final for those of you online. It'll be up starting around 3 o'clock. The first half of the final, or the first 25 questions of the final, there's like 50 questions, are the midterm. So I'll be giving you the preferred answers for that, right? Because the idea is not to screen you out with wrong answers, it's to give you the preferred answers and why they're preferred, right? Not so it's an easy A, but so that you're informed. And then taking that information, go out and make our world anew, so to speak. So, I'm going to recap where we've been and where we'll go next term. Because basically what next term will be is basically taking up where we kind of left off and continuing to the present day. And final preparation basically be covering the preferred answers of the midterm. And then I also will hand out physically instructor evaluations. And we'll go from there. So, where we've been. We've talked about ethnic studies. And the ethnic studies as an academic discipline. From and talking about Afrocentrism, which I'm basically defining in terms of my particular practice as well as others, basically emic, which is inside the culture, and a multidisciplinary approach from within the culture as well. And basically we've been talking about different constructs such as Natarianism, Kawaida, which I'll review because it's on the midterm, or rather on the final. Rites of passage, age grade set system, the concept of crash, intersectionality, isms, African psychology, African American psychology, and so where we'll go next term. So one of the things, did I talk about the strings of the Korah? Do you recall that? Okay. This is going to be one of the major extra credit sections. So you have to correctly identify these 21 elements. So the idea of the strings of the Korah, let me adjust this graphic here. The strings of the Korah is a metaphor that I developed for understanding Kawaida. And Kawaida is the construct created by Maulana Ron Karenga. You know it as the 7 days of Kwanzaa, but there's actually 21 different elements, just like a Korah. So a Korah is the instrument of the griot, which is a traditional storyteller, historian, diplomat, multilinguist, rapper, healer, and they use the Korah to improvise playing praise songs. So, for example, they could recount, if they're in a particular kingdom, they could recount the king's lineage going back to the beginning, all from memory. And that could take, like, a single praise song could take 3 days just to do that until you have it in your head, and then you travel to the next kingdom, different language, different sets of stories, all of which you have in your head. So the concept of an MC or a rapper, improvising, comes from this particular tradition. So a Korah has 21 strings, and they're divided up into the 7 strings for the past, present, and future. So it actually lends itself to the metaphor that I'm talking about in terms of looking at Karenga's Kawaida construct. So for example, the Nguzu Saba, which is the 7 principles of blackness, so using the Key Swahili language, Nguzu Saba, 7 principles. So starting with the first day of Kwanzaa, starting with the base of the pyramid, unity, umoja, self-determination, kujichagulia, collective work and responsibility, ujima, cooperative economics, ujama, purpose, nia, creativity, huumba, and imani, faith. So 7 days of Kwanzaa, and also part of the 7 principles, the first set. 7 levels, and this is basically a combination of 14 different things. And notice that this gets reformatted when you move it from one file to another. So let me just move this quickly. So you have 7 levels of organization and 7 products of culture. So 7 levels of social interaction and 7 levels of social organization, from the individual, informal group, organization, institution, community, societal, and then global level. And then 7 products of culture, spirituality and religion, politics, creative production, which includes all arts and all sciences, economics, social organization, history, and psychology. So part of why we start, even though you may have noticed this class is basically looking a lot at history, basically history to a people is like memory to a person. So you can't have a healthy psychology unless you know your history or know where you came from an Afrocentric point of view. So that's why we spend a lot of airtime on history, but we don't just do history. We also look at spirituality, economics, etc. So if I were going to look at, for example, a social problem, for example, I was watching Al Jazeera and the story about Freeway Ricky Ross and the whole crack cocaine and the Contras thing. So things that happen on the global level affect people on the individual level. So, the gang members were saying, look, we don't have any planes, we don't have any guns, we don't have anything. How is any of this stuff getting into our community? We don't speak Spanish. How all of a sudden we're flooded with Uzis and MAC-10s and AK-47s and, all the cocaine we could sell, where is that coming from? And how's the government not doing anything to stop it? Well, turned out the government wasn't doing anything to stop it because they needed to finance an illegal war. But, so things that happen on the global level affect the national level, and then, institutions and individuals on up and down, and an individual sufficiently armed with information and inspiration can affect the globe. So where do Gandhis come from, and Martin Luther Kings and Malcolm X's, and any historical figure starts with an individual and they spread their influence up and down. So these 7 levels and 7 products of culture all interact, and part of the idea here, when I combine those concepts and talk about the strings of the kora, so on your screen left is Shiva Nataraj, the Shiva that's dancing, and Shiva's holding 7 strings of the kora, just like it was an instrument. And he's standing on, instead of the traditional depiction of Shiva when he's dancing on a demon that represents the ego. So Shiva's like the lord of yogis and lord of self-mastery. So what he's standing on here is not a demon, but tradition and innovation. So an innovation is basically a creative response to a set of circumstances that needs to be solved. And if the innovation works, it becomes a tradition. Now, sooner or later, traditions will become old and worn out, and so you either have to revise them or create an innovation to respond to the gap that the tradition is no longer responding to. So these two flames, if you will, of innovation and tradition, these two strains of influence in African American culture influence each other. So as an example, we may have jazz standards, but we don't have Elvis impersonators. Because among black people, look, you could play Night in Tunisia on a kazoo, but it's better done like Dizzy Gillespie did it as the jazz orchestra. But you could do it with a trio, or you could do it as a single person. So that's part of the innovation. You follow the tradition, but the innovation is how you play it. And as a point of pride as a jazz musician, you don't want to simply imitate somebody note for note. The point is innovation. The point is improvisation.
You could scat it.
You can scat it, right. And you're not going to scat it exactly the same way twice, or the same way as, say, an Ella or a Betty Carter or any of the other giants of, jazz music, Annie Ross, whoever. So the kora is described as a species of harp. It has 21 strings, which are tuned, for example, in a major triad, but actually there's other ways of tuning it that are more complex than a simple major triad. I just use the major triad to basically say that 3 sets of strings representing the past, present, and future. When you play a kora, all the like-tuned strings vibrate with each other. In the same way, different themes in kawaida repeat and find similarity. So, for example, you might, if you're going to use this in problem solving, you could basically look to see, has this problem ever occurred before? So you're looking at history. So can I apply the historical solution to what's going now? Yes or no? What was the mindset needed to be able to apply the solution? Maybe the problem is not that historical efforts failed, it's how they were applied or who applied them, right? So using the strings of the kora or kawaida as a problem-solving construct is one of the things that I'm pointing out in terms of looking at, the tradition was Karenga taking these separate elements of African culture and human culture and putting them together. I simply put them together in a way that I could think of musically. Yeah, Eddie.
If a story is being told, does the player only play, if it's about the present, does he play those 7 strings?
You're playing all 21.
Okay.
Okay, so the way, I actually have a kora in my office, but basically the way it looks is your thumbs are resting here and you're playing somewhere the 21 strings like a harp. Like a harp, yeah. So the kora is the instrument of the griot, also known as a jali. That should be D. Yeah, that's in this particular typeface. That J looks like an I, but anyway, jali. So griots in Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Gambia variously serve as village historians, royal advisor, diplomat, mediator, teacher, exhorter, witness, praise singer, and key participant at festivals and ceremonies. So we don't have an English word equivalent of that role. So basically, my idea is a few griots probably were captured as slaves and imported to America. Koras would have been in short supply in America, so they would have need to have invented banjos. And so banjo is an African-American instrument, basically created definitely during slavery times. And basically, if you look at the design, except for the frets on a banjo, basically, there's a vibrating string on a drum head, because that's what the face of a banjo is. And so the bridge on a kora basically transmits the string sound into a hollow gourd, half a gourd, and a resonator. So rather where this website says may be the inspiration for the American banjo, I'm saying, yeah, it is. There ain't no may about it. So, two twin influences in African culture, tradition, and innovation. A response to survival needs generates an innovation. That's something that hasn't been tried before. And if the innovation works, it becomes a tradition. So obviously in the case of the banjo, not all arts of the griot get carried over into African American culture, but the blues do. And so you will actually hear people like the late Ali Farka Touré, who basically sound like bluesmen. And you begin, Taj Mahal, among others, has, recorded songs with kora players and basically talked about the Mali to Mississippi blues. And so actually I'm going to leave this up on the website so that you can see it, but the idea, so now you have enough to answer those particular questions. So Umoja, the 7 principles, all Africans, so hidden unity and diversity. Umoja means unity in Kiswahili. All Africans are one people. Kujichagulia, self-determination, to define ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves. Are we descendants of slaves or descendants of scientists and explorers? Are we up from slavery or down from the pyramids? Is there 400 years of oppression in America after slavery, or 2,500 years in America where we came here as explorers? So, Kujichagulia becomes an integral question. Which are we? Who defines and who does the defining? Ujima, collective work and responsibility, to build and maintain our community together and make our sisters and brothers' problems our problems and solve them together. So work together despite our differences to achieve goals which benefit us all. The sentiment, it takes a village to raise a child, comes out of this particular element. So Kwanzaa is not a Black Christmas. It's a public face of Kawaida, a time to practice cultural remembrance amidst the materialism of Christmas. Not so much an anti-Christmas, but practical. People are usually given the days off during the holidays, so this is a time to remember and celebrate certain aspects, healing and healthy aspects of African culture. So the Nguzo Saba are to be practiced all throughout the year, not just between Christmas and New Year's. So, and in this particular framework, Black History Month is every day. So to study the strings is then to strengthen yourself against cultural amnesia. And if you're not remembering your own culture and to understand how culture works, and also to restore it as an ally for yourself and an ally for others. So Ujamaa, cooperative economics, to build and maintain our own shops, stores, and other businesses and profit from them together. Community benefit over individual profit. There are stories that I'll talk about next term that kind of illustrate this particular principle. The concept of Ujamaa was used as by the Tanzanian economist Julius Nyerere. Basically, he named it African socialism, and he's using the term socialism not in a Marxist sense, because in order, the 3 principles of Ujamaa or African socialism, you first start with spirituality, and Marx wasn't down with spirituality. The second, you are not racist, and Marx was definitely racist. And the third is you're not sexist. And, Marx had issues with women in his life too. So I'll basically define what those things are later. So the relevance of Kemet to America and what meets the eye. So in those 7 principles, cooperative economics, Nia, purpose, Kuumba, creativity, Imani, faith. And those 7 principles are deliberately Pan-African. So then the 7 products of culture, history, the hero is the teller of the tale. When a lion learns to write, we will hear a different story. Psychology, Western equals white, African American 5 aspects of self, which again appeared on the midterm and will appear again on the final. Creative arts and sciences, politics, that is the distribution and conceptions of power. Spirituality, the relationship to your relationship to something greater. Economics, the distribution of and access to necessary resources, including information, spiritual wisdom, and social organization. So those are the 7 products of culture. And then the 7 levels of action: individual, informal group, an organization such as the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, NAACP, Organization of African American Unity, started by Malcolm X, the OAAU, the Black Panthers, the US organization, the MOVE organization, Nation of Islam, all kinds of different organizations. Institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, churches, mosques, synagogues, all within the Black community, and other organizations similar to that. Community level, the nation, so for example, the Republic of Palmares as a nation in Brazil, one of the first non-European and non-native republic in the Western Hemisphere historically. And then a level of action on the global level. So I'm going to move past this and do a quick montage of where we've been. So Africa is the source of our strength, and symbolized by the graphic, the Sphinx, and the Great Pyramid, and the motto from the Temple of Luxor, know thyself, and the lifelong learning, Adinkra symbol. Africa is the source of our strength. America is the test of our strength. So the symbology behind the pyramid, the original Trinity, Mother, Father, and the child of true humanity, Osar, Oset, Heru, Osiris, Isis, Horus. This is that statue from Ganvier, which depicts a intersex person. This is from a voodoo ceremony I witnessed in Ghana. This you will recall is the African life cycle from the Njuka Maroons, with an explanation for your handy-dandy answering of certain questions that will appear on a final near you, and the convenient answer in case you are looking for that. This is a graphic of Yeshua from Prayers of the Cosmos, Lao Tzu, Afroasiatics, Li Tigwai, a contemporary of Lao Tzu, Africoid figurine from the Indus Valley in India, a Black Buddha from Cambodia, Queen Nzinga, Moorish nobleman playing shatranj, not chess. They called it shatranj. Chess wouldn't be invented until the reconquest of Spain another 200 years later. May not have shown you this, but other Afro-European coats of arms from France, Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. There's a blow-up of that. So Morin, where basically the Greeks and the Romans both referred to black people as Moors, so you will see this actually in proper names so along the top line, screen left, Morin, Morien, Moreau, Morin, Morier, Morenberg, and then second line from the top, Schwartzman, Schwartz, and you don't necessarily see this, but the one straight over from, let's see, second from the right, second row, that says Schwarzkopf. Now, this particular page doesn't have Schwarzenegger, but basically that's where the origin of the name came from. Schwartz means black. Schwarzenegger means black and from Africa. And then on the lower right, Saracen or Saraceni, another name for Africans. Saracens, Turks. So Afro-Europeans. And of course, let me adjust this because you probably remember. The coat of arms from this particular African royal family. Defending the country of the honey dark ones, Anselm Fürstenberg Reichlich von Meldig, Fürstag von Kempten, we are the fighters. The motto for the family crest. Ibrahim Ganabal, Alexander Pushkin's grandfather, Angelo Solomon, the Freemason from Austria, who upon his death was not given a Christian burial, but was basically stuffed and mounted, put in a museum. Beethoven. True mulatto face of Queen Charlotte, Queen of England. Black Madonna from a cathedral in Spain. And then we get into African Americans. And the African self, soul, body, mind, social, relational, and tribal ancestral. So the African fivefold self. So if you see a question like that, that's what it's referring to. Lucia, African skeleton found in South America. The Olmec heads in Veracruz. General Harriet Tubman. Lawrence de Graaf. A Maroon, and the Maroons negotiating peace treaty with Jamaica. Maroon camouflage. And modern Maroons in the United States from Suriname, Texas, and Jamaica. And the the Door of No Return in Elmina Casa, Ghana. So we were leaving off at Reconstruction. So to talk about what is being reconstructed during Reconstruction. So from a mainstream history point of view, the country is being unified, that is, reconstructed from a civil war. Basically, the physical and legal infrastructure is being recreated in the South and also a little bit in the North. So the North is basically creating, all right, we're unified, you were rebels, you lost, So we're going to create new laws. So as part of the conditions of surrender for you rejoining us, and those are the constitutional amendments and civil rights laws. But not all men are created equal. So we're not creating the infrastructure for that. We are not creating an all my relations type of construct that came from the natives either. So, and it's also not a I am because we are and because we are I am that comes out of African American culture either. And it's also not all for one and one for all. So what is being reconstructed is not exactly what the African Americans, both free and formerly enslaved, are hoping for. So what's being reconstructed? So if we start with an African culture, that the imported slaves who were brought here brought to America with them. So 2,000 languages, both urban and agricultural cultures. Multicultural, multilingual, mathematical people. 12 kinds of marriage, multiple forms of religion and spirituality, a democratic ethic where there's both political activism and also moves towards egalitarian social structures and laws. And basically, the black population is estimated at about 106 million people in 1750. That's in Africa. In Africa, right? So if you add to that, in terms of the religious diversity in Africa, you add Christianity and Islam, as well as animist religions who preyed upon basically their neighbors and also sold them into slavery, and then shipped them to America, where they're then stripped of their literacy, if they had it, stripped of their numeracy, which they definitely had that because they had markets, stripped them of their languages, whatever religions they were, the egalitarian social values to the degree that those existed, constrain their human rights, and then quote unquote free them in Reconstruction. So what are they supposed to reconstruct? Based on what model? The one that they may or may not remember, or the one that's going to be developed here? What is that going to look like? Okay, and then what will they be allowed to reconstruct? So we're basically reconstructing in a limited American context as if, oh, well, we're civilizing you. So, for example, this graphic from the Wikipedia Commons, which I'd say is kind of cleaned up because this graphic doesn't show how anywhere near how crowded it actually was. Right, so Negroes in the cellar of a slave boat, which, yes, it looks pretty crowded there. But one of the things, as I had written back to one of your fellow students, because she asked me, what was it like to be in the slave fort? And I said, well, it was hard. Part of what was hard to describe is that the smell. The smell is still there. I mean, not as intense as, if you understand that, wherever you're standing, which was bare rock, but it was only bare rock as of 20 years ago, because before that they found out that it was packed excrement where they were holding, particularly in the death room, but also in the rooms where, they were holding women and children. So a slave ship like this boat graphic is, considerably cleaned up. It was way more packed than this. So when you look at the regions of Africa most affected by the slave trade, basically they're all coastal, and several different countries, and probably literally hundreds of different tribes. So Senegambia, that is Senegal and the Gambia, Upper Guinea, which is now Guinea-Bissau, Guinea and Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, the Gold Coast, the former Gold Coast, which is Ghana, and the east part of Cote d'Ivoire, the Bight of Benin, that's Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, west of the Niger Delta. Probably one of the highest percentages, 20%. The Bight of Biafra, Nigeria, east of the Niger Delta, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. And West Central Africa, so the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola, like 39% and nearly 40% of the slaves. So from that interior, and then Southeastern Africa, Mozambique, and Madagascar. So that's basically 173 African kingdoms and city-states affected. So probably an undercount, but let's just say 12 million shipped to the Americas, up to another 10 to 12 million killed or died in the process. So 45 plus distinct ethnic groups, 10 to 15 most prominent according to the records kept by the slavers. So for example, the Bakongo people of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, the Mande of Upper Guinea, the Gabe speakers of Togo, Ghana, and Benin. So people, the specific tribes, Aja, Mina, Ewe, and the Fon. The Akan people of Ghana, where we get the Adinkra symbols, in Cote d'Ivoire. The Wolof of Senegal and the Gambia. The Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. The Mbundu of Angola, which includes both the Amambundu and Oyimbundu, and the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria, the Chamba of Cameroon, the Makua of Mozambique. So, I mean, these are just hitting kind of like the high points. So basically, we understand that our contemporary, just like our states in the United States do not follow the national boundaries of the various tribes. So the boundaries of Africa do not follow the traditional boundaries of whatever the tribal areas were as well. But 173 African kingdoms and city-states affected by slavery. So, even if you assume a population in Africa of 106 million in 1750, like who's doing the counting? Because we're not doing exactly a census, right? 133 million in 1900 and 0.75 billion now. So even assuming that. Let's say that there was a maximum of 24 million involved, both the 12 million that were shipped as well as the 10 to 12 million that died in the capture and transport process. That means roughly 1 in 5 Africans were involved in the slave trade or killed or shipped to the Americas. Meaning Africa itself still had a viable and vital population, but still subject to assault and exploitation, as we'll see. Because we're going a little bit beyond just simple reconstruction, but to understand in terms of what is being reconstructed from an Afrocentric point of view. So you start pretty much with what the healthy body is and not just study the wound of slavery. So contemporary slavery, for example, is happening in Africa, Bangladesh, China, Europe, India, Mali, Mauritania, North Korea, Pakistan, Sudan, and also slavery is returned to the United States. Just to put that in perspective. So the types of slavery that we'll see in these countries contemporarily, and we can project back to just to raise the point that slavery didn't disappear, it just changed forms. So bride buying, child labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, peonage, where you're a peon, basically working like a sharecropper, essentially, sexual slavery, sweatshop labor, and wage slavery. So in the slave trade to the Civil War, once the war is over, in addition to the rebuilding or original creation of an African American identity, because essentially we're creating that out of scratch, because we ain't going back to Africa. Oh, the vast majority of us are not. So that African American identity is monolingual, but multicultural. We're forced to speak English, but we speak an English with a kind of African accent or with an African sensibility. We're converted to Christian, but that is forced to convert to Christianity if we weren't already, but it's an activist liberation theology Christianity focused on community organizing and community uplift. And others are also practicing other Abrahamic religions, or they're not practicing any religion at all. And we'll see that definitely next term when we start looking at the Harlem Renaissance and other things of that nature in terms of, so like liberation theology, even though I haven't focused a whole lot of it within the time period, basically the basic idea, especially if you think about what Frederick Douglass wrote about Christianity, is like he says I'm making a distinction between the Christianity practiced by Christ, where there were no slaves, where there were no beatings and murders and kidnappings, and the Christianity of the slaveholders. It's like night and day. So when you start seeing the writings around liberation theology and what I call black liberation theology, which basically means we're eliminating slavery, we're eliminating white supremacy, we're basically trying to start an ethic of equality that's Christian-based. And that since the only form of the Bible that we're allowed to have or know about is the King James Version, I mean, as my grandfather basically explained it to me, he said, we're liberation theologists, and we follow we use a red letter King James Version of the Bible. That is, if Jesus said it, we follow it, period. That's it, not Paul. Because Paul didn't know Jesus. Paul was a murderer, right? Jesus didn't kill anybody. So basically, Paul is the one that Massa read to us. If you saw those graphics from the other day, Paul is basically saying you slaves need to obey your master. And that's what a good slave is, and then you'll get your reward in the by and by. Well, no, we're not down with that. Jesus wants us to be free. So we're following Jesus. And Jesus says, get out of Dodge. Join the Underground Railroad. And, it's liberation. We want liberation now in this life, freedom now in this life, not salvation. We don't want to be saved. We want to be free. So that's basically the liberation theology credo, and basically using, the only Bible that we had access to, even though, we know there are other forms of the Bible. Then after the Civil War, so that whole question, the U.S. is now free to attack the Indian nations once it's unified. And one question could be asked, why? All right? Because the Civil War really did nothing to eliminate the concept or doctrines of white supremacy or sexism or any other isms, particularly classism. Who is the actual model of a class-free, egalitarian society on the continent? The native nations. So the Indian nations, so the Civil War is not creating a new and just America. It ain't doing that. It's not reconstructing that. The Indian nations, besides occupying land, represent a visible cultural threat. to the growing United States, which relied heavily on maintaining inequalities. Depends on it. The Indian nations thrived without taxes, without real estate, without racial or gender prejudice, and were independent of the need for trading in the United States. Though some of them did. And some of them also traded with, Canada, the French, the British, etc. But, they were independent. So such trade, in fact, proved to be awful unequal at best, trading in goods rather than, say, cultural technologies, if there was any trade with the United States. And often the trade was kind of weaponized. So the idea that you were one, the culture doesn't believe in real estate because you can't own something you didn't create the land. So the land is not your property to sell, so you can't trade it for beads or firewater. So the concept of real estate was alien to both Africans and Native Americans. Wait, you don't own the land. You can't, that's like owning sunlight. How do you even do that? But the United States basically would try and, induce Indians to sign papers to sell their land. And so the number of native leaders would say, no, we were not going to trade our land for firewater. We're not going to do that. So those people were actually targeted either for execution or put in mental institutions. And so basically the war, after the Civil War happens, this is where you see the war against native nations starting in earnest. Now, one means of dealing with this, so for example, would be buffalo soldiers. Now, the buffalo soldiers were often made up of what I'll refer to is, and what the historical record refers to as black Indians. This particular site talks about, this is an Afro-Mexican site, so they talk about, for example, in this particular slide, the point that must be made here is that the fact that the black population in the early colony, that is Mexico, was by far larger than that of the Spanish. In 1570, we see that the black population is about 3 times that of the Spanish. In 1646, it is about 2.5 times as large, and in 1742, blacks still outnumber the Spanish. It's not until 1810 that the Spaniards are more numerous. So around the time of Mexican independence. So remember, the Spanish had been importing black slaves to work in the silver and gold mines as well as in agriculture. And so in time, they would, naturally outpopulate them. The Afro-Mexicans, both slave and free, participated in various kinds of labor in Mexico. The majority worked in the silver mine centers and large lumbers and worked in urban centers, largely as domestic workers. So, for example, having a black servant or maid was quite the status symbol for elites. Also, as if it isn't now. Oh, now it's Mexicans. Oh, right. Or Dominicans, or, yeah. So also in urban centers, blacks, both slave and free, worked as artisans, peddlers, and craftsmen. The Africans were also deployed to rural coastal areas such as Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, and what are now the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca on the Pacific coast. Interestingly, free blacks also participated in large numbers in military service during the colonial period. So this is in Mexico. So part of where the concept of buffalo soldiers came from, well, in the United States, they were being used mostly in duty for escorting wagon trains to begin to colonize the at least unoccupied by American areas, but very rarely, in fact, probably never, as far as the records that I can see, participated in any native massacres. Those were not carried out by the Buffalo Soldiers, who were basically referred to by natives because of our woolly hair. So, for example, this is a group of Buffalo Soldiers, and it'll explain the graphic. Yeah.
I mean, if they were basically escorts for wagon trains west of the Mississippi, et cetera,
Yeah.
would they have some kind of function in terms of actually slaying buffalo for meat, for food? Would that have any relevance to it?
Well, no, I think I think it's more their hair,
Appearance.
the short afro, and the name came from natives.
So it's an insult.
It was actually a term of respect because because the buffalo was a source of life, and also with the Lakota, buffalo were basically considered a sacred
I see.
being, right? It was white buffalo woman that brought the sacred pipe to the Lakota. I mean, there's a whole story with that. So, they also actually respected them as warriors too, even though, again, there were skirmishers and things like that, but
They threw themselves during the Civil War.
Yeah.
So they had the respect.
yeah. And so, the reason I talk about Buffalo Soldiers as the kind of bridge is that it's Buffalo Soldiers that once the Indian Wars are over, and remember they're in these units because they're segregation. They're not regular army. The entire army experience, definitely in the Revolutionary War as well as the Civil War, as depicted in the movie Glory, it's all black units commanded by white officers, right? And so the Buffalo Soldiers kind of used on the frontier. There might have been some black officers, but again, they're used for escort duty, not so much, direct warfare. But by the time we see like the Spanish-American War, they are being used directly in warfare against the Spanish. But there's a whole history of them in Mexico. So this 1889 photograph of Buffalo Soldier Scouts includes the then employed and retired members of the Seminole Black Indian Nation, a large number of whom worked for the U.S. Army after earlier being employed in the Mexican Army. So that Mexican Army. So remember, who first freed the slaves? What country freed the slaves first? Mexico. Who had a black president? Who is the Mexican equivalent of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, except that he himself was a slave. So Vicente Guerrero both freed the slaves and also was like the second president of Mexico. And he himself actually freed slaves and promoted some sort of equality. So Africans could escape into Indian country, both in the north, on the east coast, and in the west, and south to Mexico. The Seminoles originally came from Florida, where they were a branch of the Creek Nation, distinguished from other Creeks in their acceptance of runaway slaves who had toiled in the former British colonies that became the U.S. So they were accepting them, and they were willing to fight alongside the natives against first the Spanish and then the British. We're talking about Florida here. So one of the reasons why the British opposed Africans and Indians getting together, like for example the examples of Jamaica and Florida, is because wherever blacks and natives got together, the natives were no slouches in battle to begin with, but they definitely improved their prowess against white populations, particularly the British and Spanish, with the addition of Africans who were also skilled and knowledgeable about the way Europeans fought. And also this was an issue with the founding fathers of Oregon, too. Like, oh, we don't want black people here because they'll mix with Indians, make trouble. The initial blacks within the Seminole villages were bound to work for the Seminoles in a relationship that was described as slavery, but without whips and chains, and with the right of the bondspeople to farm their own land. So not in ownership, but basically, so this is what caused the British to say the Indians don't know how to keep slaves, because no whips, no chains, they can marry the chief's daughter, they can farm their own plots of land. What kind of slavery is that? Non-white supremacist. Let's try that. So by the time the 1835-1838 Second Seminole War, during which the United States tried to conquer the Seminoles. They're largely mixed race, in which those of African heritage took many important decision-making positions. Chiefs, generals, etc. So Dembo Factor, who is in that picture, is one of the black Seminoles who fought in that war, the Second Seminole War, is in the photo. He's the elderly gentleman with the white beard. Screen center. And that war ended with the black Indians reluctantly agreeing to leave Florida and settle in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And during the 1840s, they were harassed by other Indian nations of the territory who considered the Seminoles to be blacks and subject to capture and sale to whites. Yeah.
Is that the Trail of Tears?
That is their Trail of Tears. There's another Trail of Tears. So all the 5 civilized tribes had their Trail of Tears. So usually when people refer to the Trail of Tears, it's usually the Salagi or Cherokee Trail of Tears, but all of them had their Trail of Tears. They were all forced to go to the outer edge, of the fledgling United States, which is like the Oklahoma Territory. Yeah. So a lot of other native nations kind of harassed them, and this is also the same situation with the Wampanoags, who made first contact with the Pilgrims, and also the Pequots, who were basically the makers of wampum. So like I compared them to like the Federal Reserve Bank of Indian Country. So other natives joined against them, those natives, in selling them in slavery to the whites. So around 1850, the Seminoles began exploring the Mexico-Texas border with the hope of resettling in Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829 by Vicente Guerrero. First efforts of the Seminoles to resettle were unsuccessful. The Mexico-Texas border was controlled by the natives of the area, the Comanches, which was basically opposed to all outsiders of any description. The Seminoles developed methods of fighting off the Comanches, and settlements were created in the Mexican state of Coahuila. In 1856, Mexican President Comonfort hired Seminole fighters to protect Coahuila and other border areas from Comanches, and also from the raids by white outlaws from the United States, from Tejas. After the U.S. Civil War and the abolition of slavery, many Seminoles returned to the U.S., where their, quote, Indian fighting abilities were acknowledged, and they became soldiers in the U.S. Army, the Buffalo Soldiers. The natives gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers because of the matted African hair. It resembled the matted hair of buffaloes. Veterans of the Civil War and other non-Seminole African Americans were also in Indian country fighting the U.S. Army. And they were then known as Buffalo Soldiers because, again, they were in segregated units. Black Seminoles continued to live along the Rio Grande. Notable Mexican Seminole town in Coahuila is named Nacimiento de los Negros. So jumping again, continents, since we have dual books, one of them focuses on the African experience. Asante talks about there's essentially, there's no other way to describe it, there's a 150-year African-European war. And he says the only way to view this engagement between Africa and Europe from 1807, the date Britain banned the slave trade, to 1957, the date the Gold Coast became independent and chose the name of the ancient empire of Ghana, that is Ghana, is a long, bitter continental war. Brutal war was fought between the two nations over the material wealth of one of them, that is Africa. Africa had not declared war on Europe, but Europe had definitely declared war on Africa. It was not a war fought on conventional terms with standing armies that respect each other, which Okay, if we're operating on the meme of white supremacy, no, there wouldn't be a fighting of equals. So Europeans used intrigue, guile, greed, avarice, betrayal, massacres. The Africans used guerrilla tactics, sabotage, non-cooperation, destruction of crops and property. So between 1492 and 1885, Europe's continental power and reach were unchallenged by any other area of the world. Hundreds of tons of gold and other metals and minerals were taken out of the Americas to enrich Europe. In fact, that kind of continues today, not necessarily by nation states, but by multinationals acting as if they were nation states. And certainly, if you are seeing this on a computer, or you have a cell phone, okay, these devices depend on strategic minerals that are taken out of Africa to this day, among other places. So one could say the war ain't over. So in the beginning of the 19th century, Britain stood alone in Europe as the master of the seas and the largest slave-running country in the world. The number of ships involved in the slave trade, for example, Liverpool, where the Beatles came from, had 60% of all slave ships. So while Africans made up the majority of slaves, the English also ethnically cleansed, and I mean that, the Highland clearances, not a clothing sale, ethnically cleansed Ireland and Scotland and sent many of those people into slavery in the Americas and West Indies alongside Africans. So African disunity, because I often get asked the question, well, what happened? Well, there were African military powers capable of defeating the now united Europe. And the reason I say united Europe is, remember, in the time of the Romans, there was no united Europe. It was an alien concept. The creation of Western civilization really begins after Europe is brought out of the Dark Ages, not on its own, but with the aid of various people of color and various other cultural technologies that allow it to begin not only to come out of the Dark Ages, but also to begin actually projecting force. So that united Europe. So example, the Songhai Empire, which was the successor to Ghana, and the Malian empires, which each one of those had military capabilities. The Songhai Empire had disintegrated a little over a century after Columbus made his quote-unquote discovery. So again, the capability existed, but there was not unity. People didn't necessarily recognize the threat. People made deals with the Portuguese in terms of building those slave forts, and was not necessarily recognizing the long-term danger. Oh, we'll trade with you for guns, gold, whatever. So the continent essentially laid in disarray. So the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference. I started including this within the lecture and basically extending the time period beyond Reconstruction, because it has also shaped our world in terms of the contemporary world too. So here's what the Berlin Conference was. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1884. The foreign ministers of 14 European powers and the United States established ground rules for the future exploitation of the quote-unquote dark continent. So if you've ever heard that phrase, Africa being referred to as a dark continent, okay? The idea is that, it's a dark continent that we're bringing civilization to, right? So Africans, of course, were not invited or made privy to the decisions of the Berlin Conference. And this photo is from the book The Horizon, History of Africa, American Heritage Publishing. So, the convention revising, this is a resolution. Convention revising the General Act of Berlin, February 26, 1885, and the General Act and Declaration of Brussels, July 2nd, 1890, the American Journal of International Law volume. So, signed in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, September 10th, 1919. So the translation of this is, whereas the General Act of the African Conference signed in Berlin on February 26, 1885, was primarily intended to demonstrate the agreement of the powers with regard to the general principles which should guide their commercial and civilizing action in the little-known or inadequately organized region of a continent where slavery and the slave trade still flourish. So, no, these are phrases of art, right? Little known by who? And inadequately organized by who? And the commercial and civilizing actions. By who? Whereas by the Brussels Declaration of July 1890, it was found necessary to modify for a provisional period of 15 years the system of free imports established for 20 years by Article 4 of said act, and since that date, no agreement has been entered into, notwithstanding the provisions of the said act and declarations. And whereas the territories in question are now under the control of recognized authorities, are provided with administrative institutions suitable to the local conditions, and the evolution of the native population continues to make progress. Wait, like there was no progress before you got there? Wishing to ensure by arrangements suitable to modern requirements the application of the general principles of civilization established by the Acts of Berlin and Brussels, who, after having communicated their full powers, recognizing good due form, have agreed as follows, and you can basically follow that link. So here's a map. If you needed colonial rule of Africa. So you can see on the map that, let me see if I can expand this a little. Yeah, okay, good. Belgian, British, French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, independent nations to the degree that there are independent nations, and mandates, which, if we're looking at what the mandates were, so some of what happened in World War I rather, when Germany lost, their colonies were given over to other countries. Okay? So it's the Berlin Conference. Right? So it's held in Berlin. So one could say, and I've heard the opinion expressed by Africans who grew up in the former colonies held by Germany, that the Germans were the worst slavers in terms of the things that went on there. Certainly, the Belgians were pretty bad in terms of, the Congo and the things that went on with diamonds and other strategic minerals and the working conditions. The Germans, not to cap so much on the Germans, but part of the reason for the conviction that Germans were some of the worst slavers is they did medical experiments. Okay, so this is like before the Holocaust and Dr. Mengele. People like Dr. Mengele actually did experiments on Africans. And we'll actually look at the whole issue next term around what Harriet Washington referred to in her book, Medical Apartheid, where you have health disparities based on experimentations done on black people from this time and also in the United States. And so if you see in the center, like the Belgian Congo, and then places, let's see, so America has only essentially one colony, and that's Liberia. So America was at the Berlin Conference because they can get Liberia, but everybody else gets everything else. So, the white man's burden. This is three things. A Rudyard Kipling poem. In the dictionary, is defined as the supposed responsibilities of the white race to rule and civilize other races. And a movie, which played here in Eugene, with Harry Belafonte and John Travolta, which is, I'll show you the graphic. It was actually, I thought it was funny. A lot of white people in the theater were not laughing, but I thought it was hilarious. I think you can get it on Netflix. So, the white man's burden. So, this graphic, if you understand the concept of, graphic grammar or visual grammar. Visual grammar is the term in film. So, you have Uncle Sam, John Bull, and the Kaiser all being carried by black people. And they're riding a black person basically as kind of like a mule or a horse or whatever. And this is actually what you get when you Google white man's burden, because it was a graphic that's contemporary. The white man's burden is also found in soap. The concept being, if you look at, the white man in question, the first step toward lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, which is, and with Pear soap. Pear soap is a potent factor in beginning the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. Let's see. Pear soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth, in civilizing, and as civilization advances with, let's see. Yeah, I'll have to look at that. But here's the idea. So, soap and water is a civilizing influence. Yeah.
And pears is still very, very popular in England today.
Yes, I bet.
Selling,
Here is the graphic that actually originally appeared with Rudyard Kipling's poem. So here you have a Teddy Roosevelt Rough Rider figure, in boots and military garb, with the U.S. on his canteen, carrying the big-lipped savage, wearing the grass skirt and the spear, a dead person, with the shoes lying in the grass, carrying him up the hill to the schoolhouse. And then finally I made reference to the film. Let me adjust this graphic. So, The White Man's Burden basically is like a photo reverse of America, in which, so it's filmed in LA. And so, John Travolta plays a poor white laborer living in Watts, which is a white ghetto. And Harry Belafonte is a rich black guy living in Bel Air, in Beverly Hills. And so, they've got like white lawn jockeys, They've got all, I mean, it's like a photo reverse of America. I mean, that's why it was kind of funny to me. I mean, I laughed. It's like, oh, right. Yeah, okay. You've got kente cloth and African statuary here in Beverly Hills. You have, black judges, and Travolta gets arrested by a minor offense and gets beaten by black cops. And, he says, well, this is all a misunderstanding. So he goes up to Harry Belafonte's house and tries to explain what happened. And look, no, and he blows them off. So he, does this whole rage thing. It's, white man's burden. And it was, it's like I said, a photo reverse of America. It was directed by an Asian director. Yeah. And so, like I said, black people thought it was a comedy because, no way this would happen, but it's funny. But some people didn't see the joke in Springfield. The white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half-deviled and half-child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, to check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit, to work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no iron rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The porch ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go, make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye will or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent sullen peoples shall weigh your God and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise, comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. So, this made a stir at the time. So, Benjamin Tillman, this is an extract from the speech on the U.S. Senate. As though coming at the most opportune time possible, you might say just before the treaty reached the Senate or about the time it was sent to us, there appeared in one of our magazines a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the greatest poet of England at this time. This poem, unique and in some places too deep for me, is a prophecy. I do not imagine that in the history of human events, any poet has ever felt inspired to clearly portray our danger and our duty. It is called The White Man's Burden. With the permission of senators, I will read a stanza, and I beg senators to listen to it, for it is well worth their attention. This man has lived in the Indies. In fact, he's a citizen of the world and has been all over it and knows whereof he speaks. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. I will pause here. I intend to read more, but I wish to call attention to a fact which may have escaped the attention of the senators thus far. That with 5 exceptions, every man in this chamber who has had to do with the colored race in this country voted against the ratification of the treaty. It was not because we are Democrats, but because we understand and realize what it is to have two races side by side, and that cannot mix or mingle without deterioration and injury to both and the ultimate destruction of the civilization of the higher. And guess who he means by that? We of the South have borne this white man's burden of a colored race in our midst since their emancipation and before. It was a burden on our manhood and our ideas of liberty before they were emancipated. It is still a burden, although they have been granted the franchise, i.e. the vote. It is still a burden. It clings to us like the shirt of Nessus, and we are not responsible because we inherited it, and your fathers as well as ours are responsible for the presence amongst us of that people, black people. So, in case you are not up on your Greek mythology, the shirt of Nessus. Nessus was a centaur. Centaurs are usually tutors to Greek heroes and sons of gods and goddesses and things like that. And apparently, through treachery, Nessus got killed, and his blood soaked his shirt, so whoever wore the shirt was in agony from the blood of Nessus. Right? So he's basically saying it's the agony of living side by side with newly emancipated black people is such a burden.
And inescapable.
And inescapable, right. Why do we as a people want to incorporate into our citizenship 10 million more of a different or of differing races, 3 or 4 of them, differing races? But we have not incorporated them yet. Let us see what this English poet has to say about it and what he thinks. Take up the white man's burden, no iron rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The porch ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. So, I'm going to leave it here, mostly because this particular piece now sets a tone for post-Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century. Because what's happening here is also following up with the Buffalo Soldiers, basically the Spanish-American War, and other wars, setting up World War I, World War II. And so, the white man's burden, most people know of Rudyard Kipling as kind of, he created the Jungle Book, Mowgli, et cetera, but he also wrote this piece, which became kind of like a political guidebook.
White racist touchstone.
White racist touchstone. So, now we come to the preferred answers for the midterm. So, Alkebulan is the indigenous name for the continents the Greeks called Africa. Kemet in Egypt are 2 names in 2 different languages, with both mean land of the blacks. The 10 Commandments resemble the Egyptian principles of the Declarations of Innocence, are also known as the 42 Principles of Ma'at. Nubia is a Kemetic word which means land of gold. According to Naim Akbar, how many parts are there to the African self? And then name them. Soul, spiritual; body, physical; mind, personal; social, relational; and ancestral. Name 4 Semitic languages with a sigh of satisfaction, so an easy mnemonic: Aramaic, Arabic, Amharic, and Hebrew. Where does the word colonization come from? Christopher Columbus's actual name, Cristobal Colon. Cristobal Colon asked, "Where's the gold?" What was the African name? The Taino reported for the gold alloy that the spear points were made from in that particular first contact story. The African name is Guanine. Constructs of race can be devised for distributing power and access in society. Name 4 that we've discussed in class. So the indigenous 4 directions: people of the east, people of the south, people of the west, people of the north. In order: yellow, black, red, and white. The 18th century European oid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. 20th century Federal 5+, white, black, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, American Indian, Alaska Native. And then the 4th construct, the Western Science Biological, that is, there's one race, the human race. Tulipit, Wapakisanep, or the long-reaching land, was commonly known by its inhabitants as Turtle Island, or was it known as in Alkebulan? Atalanta, water metal, the circuit of the world. There are other options, and then at the bottom, primarily A and B. Say peace in the 4 Semitic languages: Hebrew shalom, Arabic salam, Amharic selam, and Aramaic shalama. Comparatively, what are the translated meanings of the names given to the founder of the Christian religion? Yeshua, the supreme being, saves and restores, and Jesus, healing Zeus, Ia Zeus. So 13, what is the translated meaning of the term Christ from the terminology of the Egyptian mystery schools, anointed one? In Arabic, what is the name of the constellation American slaves used to escape to Canada? Some of you named different stars in the constellation, but the constellation is Al-Mizan. Name the 6 isms. Type 1, overt individual. Type 2, covert individual, also known as microaggressions, is one type of them. Type 3, unconscious institutional. Type 4, conscious legal conscious institutional. Type 5, illegal conscious institutional. And type 6, socio-structural violence. 16, enumerate the elements of crash, class, race, and under race, religion and spirituality, age, ability, and addiction, sexism, and heterosexism. One construct of understanding intersectionality. And let's see, 17, name the translated meanings of the star, which is the furthermost star in the handle of the Big Dipper, Al-Qaeda, the commander, the code, and the base or foundation of the fortress wall. Name 3 circles in the Njuka maroon life cycle and describe what happens between birth and death. Aka, Ninseki, and the life cycle, visible and invisible. Basically, in the visible, you're born, you die, and after your death, you transition through the invisible world and reincarnate. 19, according to a Register Guard article in the 90s, the oldest book in the world is an Egyptian Bible dating back to 450 AD, currently in the British Museum in Cairo, and it's the Aramaic Peshitta. Adam's first wife was Lilith. Name the 4 rivers mentioned as encompassing the Garden of Eden, using today's names for them. So people who actually use the biblical names for them prefer that you use the English names for them where it's English. So the Blue and White Nile, because that's how it appears so it's the Blue and White Nile and Tigris and Euphrates. Explain the difference between the European Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. So you could basically use a time-based thing or, whatever the contemporary definition is. I'll accept and did accept both. Name 3 slave ports where Europeans were engaged as slaves. There was about 7 or 8 of them. I would accept any of them in combination. Name the city which in 1000 Common Era had the largest library on the planet. That's Cordoba. When did the first Africans come to America? There was some people actually put in 1619. Like, have you not paid attention to the class? Let's say 850 BC. Let's see, yeah, this is actually later. This is actually giving away the final, so I won't do that. All right, so, yes?
Is the final comprehensive or just from the midterm to now?
The final is comprehensive. It includes the midterm. Yeah, so it includes the midterm till now. And since you're the only one here, I'll give you this, and you can return it to,
Your office?
well, yeah, not my office, social
Social
science.
science, yeah. 4th floor.
Because I'm not supposed to see it, and I'm not even supposed to be in the room. But we're in television
Right.
now. So we technically have like 15 minutes to go, which I could actually fill with content.
So if the rest of the class submit these electronically?
I'm not sure. I think there is an ability to do that. But I'm not sure.
Just curious.
I was going to, yeah, I was curious too, actually, but it's above my pay grade. See, we did colorism. The white man's burden. Prayers of the cosmos, stillness that. This is not on the final because we didn't get into axiology that much. But I could do that because we have air. So let me do axiology. So, a brief axiological excursion. So, axiology in philosophy is the philosophical study of values. That's out of Western civilization. So, also, in this concept, African-American industrial psychologist Edwin Nichols, still alive and developed this philosophical construct. So Ed Nichols, he's still alive, living in DC, clinical industrial psychologist working in organizational development and director of Nichols and Associates. It's a applied behavioral science firm affecting technology transfer to organizations based on principles of philosophy, basic and behavioral science. So the technology that he's talking about transferring is a construct that he developed that basically studies cultural values. And his basic idea is that a culture, he's essentially said or posited that within his particular construct, there are 4 broad axiologies for the planet. And an axiology was developed at the beginning of these cultures, and basically still affects them because it's unconsciously passed on. Now, when you think about 7 billion people reduced to 4 broad constructs, a reductionist model is not necessarily going to be totally accurate, particularly where there's acculturation and assimilation. And what I mean by acculturation and assimilation I'm talking in psychological terms, not so much anthropological terms, because anthropologically they can be used interchangeably, but psychologically they're very different. So if I assimilate a carrot, okay, I chew up the carrot at one end in my mouth and it comes out the other end unrecognizable as a carrot. And I basically take all the nutrients out of the carrot. So that's assimilation. So acculturation, so basically when we're talking about assimilation, that means if you're an ethnic person coming to America, what America is built on is erasing any trace of your ethnicity and wherever you came from and becoming American, which by definition is you're an American. Wherever you came from before, you ain't that no more. So you have to speak English, speak the president's English, and know the president's history better than the president and all that kind of stuff. Acculturation is basically so in assimilation you're erasing your native culture. In acculturation you're taking on cultural technologies, beliefs, but still maintaining your own. So acculturation would be like me learning how to do chopsticks. Which fork is the salad fork? Where can I eat chicken with my hands or not? So Ed basically said, so that technology transfer then is basically allowing people to utilize perceivable differences, and that helping organizations achieve systemic congruence through cultural competence, thus assuring a competitive edge. So when he basically presented these workshops, it was to organizations that could pay him $1,500 a day, like when I first met him. And basically he said, really, if you want to study axiology, you should take a month. But since no organization will pay for a month, here we have a 2-day workshop, or more often a 1-day workshop, in which he's basically rushing through all of these things. So he first introduced me to, I'd been introduced to some of the materials that he used for my grandfather. The stuff on Charlotte and Black Europeans and things like that. So Dr. Nichols himself was educated at Assumption College in Windsor, Canada, Eberhard Karls Universität Tübingen, Germany, Leopold Franzen Universität Innsbruck, Austria, where he received a Doctor of Philosophy and Psychology and Psychiatry, cum laude. And so he speaks multiple languages. So pretty interesting cat. So a construct to help people from different cultural backgrounds work together. So it's any kind of strategic planning involves conflict, potentially who is considered a leader, what kinds of power they have, what kinds of power can they delegate, how is power lost and gained, and what is the culture of those who are in power and those who are powerless, psychologically. So there's a hidden dimension of culture that defines those and other questions. So the question is not simply who decides which cultures are in operation, it's also detecting which cultures are in operation for yourself and making the appropriate adjustment to your own actions. So part of that is I'm teaching in a European American axiology, but I'm teaching an African American class. So my basic axiology is kind of at odds with the culture that generates this class in terms of historical erasure and all those kind of things. So I have to understand both where I'm coming from and where they're coming from, still be on time, still deliver content in a particular fashion. Plus, then there's also the axiology of, television, like which culture developed television, and the technology itself forces a certain cultural framework to be utilized over others.
So it's like a mixture of those constructs.
Yeah. So axiology, for example, is the study of the philosophical basis of a given culture's values. So if we look at other English words with that prefix, axis, axiom, see that an axis, we have an imaginary line about which a world revolves or a worldview turns. In mathematics, an axiom is something we hold to be true without proof, i.e., a thing equals itself. The identity element. A thing equals itself. So, in psychological terms, values are things that we hold to be true without proof. So axiology is the basic assumption that a culture operates on. And because they're unconscious, basically people are run by them. So for example, some of how an axiology works is basically in the artifacts they produce. So for example, an eagle feather staff in Native American, or Tenochtitlan, which is a Native American city, the African drum, a djembe, the African city and the University Timbuktu, a sitar, the instrument, an acupuncture needle, Bombay or Beijing, cities from the Asian axiology, a television monitor, a portable computer in the Euro-American axiology, Los Angeles, New York, Silicon Valley. What are the multicultural cities who became, more cosmopolitan, but cosmopolitan in a certain mode. Corporations, of course, are a form of technology. Mondragon Corporation, Basque, Spain, is different than 3M or IBM. Educational systems and pedagogy are a form of technology. So, for example, LCC is different from the University of Timbuktu or Sankor or Luxor. So all these technologies reflect certain cultural values. And I'll try and expand this, but an axiology encompasses, an axiology is like can be stated as the highest value for a culture. So let's see if we skip to this, yes.
Is it a question of identifying that cultural core and then determining why it's that way?
Yeah. So here's a handy dandy chart. So an axiology or core value. So for European, the highest value is the acquisition or control of the object or product. The view of time is linear. Time moves from the past, present, and future. Time is an object. Time is money. The way of knowing is counting and measuring. So the way you often see this socialized is the first toys given to children are blocks with letters and numbers. So you can name your objects and count your objects, right? The way of reasoning is dichotomous logic, either or, positive, negative, good, bad, false, true. And the process is all sets are repeatable and reproducible. African, Middle Eastern, African American, and North Central and South American values. The highest value, he used to call this African Hispanic. The highest value is in the quality of relationships between people. The view of time is spiral, cyclical. What goes around comes around, the African proverb that says that. Symbolic imagery and rhythm. So not only musical rhythm, but also periodicity. What goes around comes around. It's predictable. It's going to come around again. Diunital logic, or the union of complementary opposites. And then all sets are interrelated through human and spiritual networks. The Asian American, Polynesian, and Pacific Islander axiology, the highest value is the cohesion of the group. Time moves in a circle, all eternity in a single movement, the concept of karma. The Vietnam War Memorial by Maya Lin is based on this construct. The way of knowing is striving towards transcendence. The objective world is conceived independent of thought and mind, and all sets are independently interrelated in the harmony of the universe. And finally, Native American, the highest value, all is in the Great Spirit. Time moves in a circle, cyclical. The cycle of life, belonging as a child, mastery as an adolescent, interdependence as an adult, and the giveaway, generosity, the elder. The logic, the way of reasoning, is quadriunidal, the resolution and right relationship of the four directions. So, see you next term. Right, yeah. And he's also talking about European as male dominant